Somewhere over southern Kuwait, February 1991, 2:30 in the morning, and the desert floor is a black void stretching to the horizon. A crew of two sits in a cockpit designed during the Kennedy administration, staring at an infrared screen that turns the world below into a ghostly television broadcast. On that screen, a T-72 sits parked in a revetment, its engine still warm enough to glow white against the cool sand. The weapons systems officer locks the crosshairs. A 2,000-pound GBU-12 falls away from the jet's belly. 23 seconds of silence. Then the tank becomes a white flare that blooms and fades. The crew doesn't celebrate. They're already slewing the targeting pod to the next vehicle, 400 meters east. They will do this again and again for the next 40 minutes, dropping bomb after bomb with the patience of someone pulling weeds from a garden. And when they turn for home, they will have killed more armor in a single sortie than most ground units destroyed in the entire war. By the time Desert Storm ended, the F-111Fs of the 48th Tactical Fighter Wing had destroyed roughly 1,500 Iraqi armored vehicles. 1,500. The wing flew approximately 2,200 combat sorties across 42 days of war, and their kill rate per mission was so far beyond anything the Air Force had projected that intelligence officers initially questioned whether the crews were overcounting. They weren't. Post-war bomb damage assessments confirmed the numbers and in some cases revised them upward. A swing-wing bomber originally built to deliver nuclear weapons at treetop level across the plains of Eastern Europe had somehow become the most efficient tank killer in the theater. More lethal per sortie than the A-10 Warthog. More consistent than any Apache helicopter. More devastating than the ground forces that would later roll through those same positions and find nothing but burned-out hulls, and more prolific than the F-15Es that were supposed to own that role. This channel runs on people who find this kind of buried history worth their time. If you're one of them, a like and a subscribe go further than you'd think. And if there's a battle or a weapons system you want the full breakdown on, the comment section is where that starts. The central irony of the Gulf War's air campaign is that the platform everyone talked about, the F-15E Strike Eagle, the F-117 stealth fighter, the A-10 with its famous gun, wasn't the one doing the most damage to Saddam's armored divisions. The aircraft racking up the highest kill counts was a Vietnam-era airframe that most defense journalists had written off as a relic, a Cold War leftover awaiting retirement. Nobody was putting the F-111 on magazine covers, and the Iraqi tank crews on the receiving end had no idea what was happening to them. This is what reshapes the entire narrative. At 20,000 feet, in the dead of night, the F-111F was invisible. Its engine noise never reached the ground, and it carried no navigation lights. The infrared targeting pod could identify individual vehicles from 4 miles of altitude, distinguish a tank from a truck, a live engine from a cold decoy. The first indication an Iraqi crew had that they were under attack was the sound of a laser-guided bomb arriving at roughly the speed of sound, which meant, of course, that they heard nothing at all before it hit. Survivors from adjacent vehicles reported explosions that came from nowhere. Tanks detonating one after another in sequence with no aircraft visible. No muzzle flash in the sky, no warning of any kind. Crews abandoned their vehicles and ran into the open desert. Some units lost half their armor in a single night without ever identifying what was killing them. August 2nd, 1990, 4 a.m. local time, and the lead elements of 3 Iraqi Republican Guard divisions are crossing the Kuwaiti border. By noon, they own Kuwait City. By nightfall, Saddam Hussein controls 20% of the world's proven oil reserves, and roughly 4,500 tanks are either inside Kuwait or staged along the southern Iraqi border waiting to follow. The Pentagon's initial assessment lands on the president's desk within hours. The language is measured, bureaucratic. The implications are not. If Saddam keeps pushing south into Saudi Arabia's eastern province, there is nothing on the ground capable of stopping him. 4,500 tanks. You have to sit with that number for a moment to understand what the coalition was staring at. Iraq fielded the 4th largest standing army on the planet, over 900,000 men under arms, 66 divisions, a force built almost entirely around Soviet armored doctrine. The backbone was the T-72, a 41-ton main battle tank with composite armor, a 125mm smoothbore gun, and an autoloader that could put 8 rounds downrange per minute. Iraq had roughly 1,000 of them. Behind those sat hundreds of T-62s, older but still lethal, plus over 2,000 T-55 variants that Saddam's generals considered expendable enough to park in the forward defensive belts as speed bumps for a coalition ground assault. The Iraqi army had spent 8 years fighting Iran in a war that killed somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million people on both sides. These were not parade ground soldiers. They knew how to dig in and build defensive berms, how to lay minefields that funneled attackers into kill zones. And they were digging in deep. By October, Iraqi combat engineers had constructed an elaborate defensive network across southern Kuwait. Triple-strand concertina wire backed by sand berms 12 feet high. Anti-tank ditches filled with crude oil, ready to be ignited. Minefields stretching for miles. Some estimates put the total number of mines at over 500,000. The fire trenches alone could turn a breach attempt into an inferno. Behind all of this sat the armor, dispersed into individual revetments that made each tank its own fortified position. The Republican Guard's Tawakkalna, Medina, and Hammurabi divisions held the reserve line further back, positioned to counterattack any coalition penetration. A senior British officer who reviewed the defensive layout later described it as the most comprehensive prepared position since the Siegfried Line. Whether that comparison holds up to scrutiny is debatable. What isn't debatable is that punching through it with ground forces alone would cost thousands of coalition lives. So the air campaign was supposed to fix this. Operation Desert Storm began on January 17, 1991, with a massive aerial assault targeting command bunkers, air defenses, communications nodes, power infrastructure. The opening nights were spectacular. F-117s dropping precision munitions through ventilation shafts, Tomahawk cruise missiles threading between buildings in downtown Baghdad, the entire Iraqi integrated air defense network collapsing within 72 hours. But there was a problem, and it became obvious within the first 2 weeks. The strategic targets were dying. The tanks were not. Coalition planners had assumed that cutting off Iraqi forces from their command structure would cause units to disintegrate. Demoralized troops, severed from headquarters, would surrender or abandon their equipment. Some did. Most didn't. The Republican Guard divisions in particular maintained cohesion even after their communications were shredded. They dispersed their armor further and covered vehicles with camouflage netting, then built decoys out of plywood and sheet metal that looked convincing enough on satellite imagery to absorb real bombs. American intelligence estimated that after 2 weeks of around-the-clock bombing, Iraqi armored strength in the Kuwaiti theater had been degraded by maybe 15%. General Norman Schwarzkopf wanted 50% attrition before he would commit ground forces. At the current rate, the math didn't work. The ground offensive would either launch against a still formidable armored force, or it would be delayed weeks, maybe months, while the air campaign ground on. The standard approach wasn't solving the problem because it was built around a daytime model. Strike packages of F-16s and A-10s hitting area targets in daylight, dodging anti-aircraft fire, dropping unguided munitions on positions that may or may not still contain the vehicles that were there yesterday. The Iraqis learned to move at night. Coalition aircraft mostly didn't hunt at night, which meant that every morning the targeting map was already out of date. What do you do when your billion-dollar air force can't kill tanks fast enough? You reach for the airplane nobody's been paying attention to. The F-111F had been sitting at RAF Lakenheath in Suffolk, England, since 1977, home station of the 48th Tactical Fighter Wing, a unit whose entire Cold War mission was to fly low and fast across the North German plain, delivering tactical nuclear weapons onto Soviet armored columns pouring through the Fulda Gap. That mission shaped everything about the aircraft. The variable sweep wings could tuck back to 72 degrees for Mach 2.2 dashes at treetop altitude, then spread forward for the slow loiter speeds needed to find and designate targets. The crew of two sat side by side in a capsule that doubled as an escape pod. the entire cockpit section could separate from the aircraft and parachute to Earth, a feature unique among American tactical jets. General Dynamics had originally envisioned it as a joint Navy-Air Force fighter back in the early 60s, Robert McNamara's pet project, and the development was a disaster. Cost overruns, crashes, a Navy version that was too heavy to land on carriers. The F-111 earned a reputation as a troubled aircraft long before it earned anything else. Its first combat deployment to Vietnam in 1968 saw 3 jets lost in the opening weeks, and the Air Force quietly pulled the entire fleet back to figure out what was going wrong. But by 1990, the F model that Lakenheath flew was a fundamentally different machine from those early disasters. And the difference had a name: Pave Tack. This was a Ford Aerospace infrared targeting pod that lived in a cradle beneath the fuselage, rotating down and forward when activated to give the weapons systems officer a stabilized thermal image of the ground below. Detection range for heat signatures exceeded 15 miles. It could track a moving vehicle. Most critically, it contained a laser designator that could paint a target with a coated beam, guiding a GBU-12 Paveway II laser-guided bomb with a circular error probable of around 3.6 feet. 3.6 feet. From 4 miles up, in total darkness, the weapons systems officer could put a 500-pound bomb through the engine deck of a specific tank in a specific revetment. The Pave Tack system had actually been operational since the early 80s, but almost nobody outside the tactical bombing community understood what it meant for the tank-killing problem. The F-15E Strike Eagle carried the newer Lantern pod and got all the press coverage, and the A-10 had its legendary GAU-8 cannon and its cult following. Meanwhile, the F-111F just kept quietly training with a targeting system that most defense journalists didn't bother to write about. The combination was lethal in a way the coalition desperately needed. The F-111F could carry 4 GBU-12s per sortie. It could loiter over a target area for extended periods without refueling. It operated exclusively at night, which meant it owned the hours when Iraqi crews thought they were safe. And the Pave Tack pod could find targets that didn't appear on any pre-planned strike list, targets of opportunity, vehicles that had moved since the last satellite pass, armor that the daytime jets had missed entirely. The 48th Tactical Fighter Wing was about to turn a 15% attrition rate into something Schwarzkopf could work with. They called it tank plinking. The term sounds almost playful, like tossing rings at bottles on a carnival midway. What it actually meant was killing armored vehicles one at a time, methodically, for hours on end. The tactic crystallized in early February 1991, and nobody in a planning cell designed it. It came from the crews themselves. The first few nights of dedicated armor hunting were experimental. F-111Fs would arrive over an assigned kill box at 20,000 feet. The weapons systems officers sweeping the Pave Tack pod across miles of desert floor, watching the infrared display for the telltale bright rectangles of tank engines against cool sand. One pilot from the 493rd Tactical Fighter Squadron described the screen as looking like a dark gray ocean with little white coffins scattered across it. His word: coffins. The smell inside the cockpit was stale rubber and sweat, the oxygen masks pressed tight against faces for hours at a stretch, the environmental system recycling the same dry air until your throat cracked. Outside the canopy, nothing. Absolute blackness above and below, the only reference point being the green glow of instruments and that flickering infrared image. The technique became ruthlessly systematic within days. A crew would enter the kill box, identify a cluster of revetments, and work them left to right or north to south. One bomb per vehicle, one vehicle at a time. The weapons systems officer would lock the laser designator onto the first target. The pilot would pickle a single GBU-12, and both would watch the bomb fall for its 20-odd seconds of flight time. Impact. Confirmation. Then the pod slewed to the next target. A good crew could expend all 4 bombs in under 12 minutes, each one striking a different vehicle. On a busy night, they'd hit the tanker on the way home, take on fuel, return to base, rearm, and fly a second sortie before dawn. Some crews flew 3 sorties in a single night. The Iraqis had no counter for this. Their anti-aircraft guns couldn't reach 20,000 feet. Their surface-to-air missiles, mostly SA-6s and SA-8s, needed radar guidance, and the coalition's electronic warfare campaign had degraded those radars to the point of near uselessness. Firing a missile meant activating a radar, which meant attracting a harm anti-radiation missile from a nearby F-4G Wild Weasel. So, the Iraqi air defenders mostly stayed dark, and the tank crews below them died in sequence without a single round fired in response. The attrition rate jumped from 15% to 25%, then 30%, then passed Schwarzkopf's 50% threshold in certain sectors. By the time the ground war launched on February 24th, entire Iraqi brigades existed only on paper. Their equipment reduced to burned metal in sand revetments, destroyed by crews they never saw, flying aircraft they never heard. A single GBU-12 Paveway II cost roughly $21,000 in 1991 money. The T-72 it was aimed at cost between $1.5 and $2.4 million, depending on the export variant and what the Soviets charged their friends. That cost ratio, roughly 100-to-1 in favor of the bomb, is the kind of arithmetic that makes entire procurement strategies obsolete overnight. The 48th Tactical Fighter Wing flew 2,516 combat sorties during Desert Storm. 66 F-111Fs deployed to Taif Air Base in Saudi Arabia, and on peak nights, the wing launched over 40 aircraft in a single wave. The mission planning cell ran around the clock, with intelligence officers updating killbox assignments based on the previous night's infrared footage. Crews coming off a sortie would debrief while the next shift was already walking to their jets. The ramp at Taif smelled like jet fuel and hot brake pads at all hours, ground crews working under floodlights to hang fresh GBU-12s on pylons still warm from the last flight. Turnaround times dropped below 90 minutes. The whole operation had the relentless cadence of a factory floor, except the product was burning armor. By mid-February, the numbers were becoming difficult for Central Command's own analysts to believe. The 48th was claiming over 100 vehicle kills per night on good nights. Bomb damage assessment teams scrambled to verify, cross-referencing infrared strike footage with satellite passes and RF-4C reconnaissance runs. The verification bottleneck actually became a planning problem. The wing was destroying targets faster than intelligence could confirm them. A declassified Air Force assessment from 1993 puts the 48th's total at approximately 1,500 armored vehicles destroyed during the air campaign. 1,500! From a single wing flying a single aircraft type that the service had been planning to retire. The F-15E community, flying with newer equipment and considerable skill, achieved roughly similar per sortie effectiveness, but with fewer airframes dedicated to the tank plinking role. The A-10s, for all their fearsome reputation, operated in daylight and at lower altitude, where ground fire remained a real hazard. 2 were lost and several more damaged, badly enough to require depot-level repair. The F-111F lost 0 aircraft to enemy action during the entire war. 0. Most people don't know this because it gets buried under footage of smart bombs going through doorways and A-10 gun camera tape that made for better television. The F-111F's war happened in the dark, recorded only on grainy infrared video that showed white-hot blooms where tanks used to be. No dramatic low-altitude passes, no tracers arcing past canopies. Just a methodical, almost industrial erasure of an army's offensive capability from an altitude where the crews couldn't even hear their own bombs detonate. The Iraqi response to this escalating destruction is where the story turns grim in a different way. Tank crews who survived the first week of plinking figured out that their vehicles were being targeted by heat signature, so they stopped running their engines at night. When that didn't work, the desert sun heated the metal enough during the day to maintain a thermal contrast for hours after sunset. They tried parking next to buildings, under bridges, inside civilian structures. Entire units reportedly drained their fuel tanks and abandoned their vehicles, walking north toward Basra on foot. The rest stayed and died in place, either because they were ordered to or because they had nowhere else to go. A captured Republican Guard lieutenant colonel, interviewed at a coalition processing facility after the ceasefire, said through a translator that his battalion lost 11 of 14 tanks over 3 nights. He never saw an aircraft. He never heard an explosion until it was already happening. He described the experience as fighting ghosts. Whether that's his exact phrasing or the translator's interpretation, the records don't clarify. What the records do clarify is the ground war math. When the coalition's armored divisions finally crossed the line of departure on February 24th, they advanced into Iraqi positions that had been hollowed out from the inside. The famous 100-hour war, 4 days of ground combat that routed what remained of Saddam's military in Kuwait, was possible because the armored reserve that should have counterattacked into the coalition's flanks simply didn't exist anymore in sufficient strength. The Tawakkalna Division fought hard at the Battle of 73 Easting. The Medina Division made a stand south of Basra. But these were remnants engaging with a fraction of their authorized equipment, and American M1 Abrams tanks cut through them in hours. Schwarzkopf got his 50% attrition. In some Republican Guard divisions, the actual figure was closer to 70. The ground troops who rolled through those shattered Iraqi positions found something the infrared cameras hadn't shown. Boots still sitting next to cots. Tea glasses, half full. The small, ordinary debris of men who left in a hurry or didn't leave at all. Colonel Tom Lennon flew the 48th Tactical Fighter Wing home to Lakenheath in March 1991. 5 years later, he watched the Air Force retire every F-111 in the inventory. The official ceremony at Lakenheath took place on December 19, 1996, a cold Suffolk afternoon. The kind of gray English sky that Aardvark crews had been flying under for 2 decades. The aircraft went to the boneyard at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base in Arizona, where they sit in rows on the desert hardpan to this day, their swing wings locked forward in what looks uncomfortably like a shrug. The Royal Australian Air Force kept theirs flying until 2010, making them the last operator. But the American Aardvark's combat career ended with Desert Storm. And what a strange final act it was. An aircraft designed for nuclear strike in Central Europe, built under a procurement scandal that nearly killed it, then redeemed late in life by a targeting pod bolted to its belly as an afterthought. The F-111F proved a concept that the Air Force spent the next 3 decades building its entire force structure around. Every air campaign since, Serbia in '99, Afghanistan in 2001, Iraq again in 2003, has run on the same basic formula the 48th stumbled into over Kuwait. Find targets with sensors. Hit them with precision munitions from an altitude where the enemy can't shoot back. The 2,000-pound JDAM that replaced the Paveway series costs about $22,000 per unit, almost identical to what a GBU-12 cost a decade earlier. And it doesn't even need a laser, just GPS coordinates and gravity. No conventional army has fought American air power in open terrain since February 1991. The reason is sitting in the Arizona desert with its wings locked forward. The Republican Guard lieutenant colonel who described fighting ghosts was repatriated to Iraq after the ceasefire. His name doesn't appear in any English-language source I've been able to locate. Schwarzkopf retired in 1992 and died in 2012 in Tampa, Florida. Tom Lennon made Brigadier General. The 48th Fighter Wing they dropped tactical in the '93 reorganization still flies from Lakenheath today, operating F-35A Lightning IIs. Most of the weapons systems officers who worked the Pave Tack pods over Kuwait retired as lieutenant colonels or full colonels in the late '90s and early 2000s. A handful took airline jobs. One runs a barbecue restaurant in San Antonio. On the morning of February 28, 1991, the last F-111F sortie of the war landed at Taif, and the weapons systems officer climbed out of the cockpit, walked to the intelligence tent, and started filling out his post-mission report.